Jordan Peterson joins me now. You're clearly involved centrally in the culture wars. Were you drafted into these wars, or were you a volunteer?
I would say a little of column A and a little of column B, but mostly I volunteered.
Why?
Because the government stepped outside of its mandate and dared to bring in legislation compelling speech. And that had never been done in the history of British common law. And they did it in the guise of a false compassion and in ignorance and in willful blindness. They made a big mistake. And so there's no way, once I had read the policies and understood what was happening, that I was going to stand for that, insofar as I had any choice.
It's the case, though, that common courtesy leads us to address people in ways that they feel easy with. You're happy with that as an account?
Sure, and thrilled with common courtesy. But it's a whole different thing when the government uses an ideologically motivated claim of compassion to justify implementing careless, unbelievably careless compelled speech legislation.
But you're not against the state's intervention in all areas of life, are you?
Well, it depends on the area.
No, but in principle, I mean, there are some.
No.
You're not an Oklahoma guy who wants to go back into the woods and get rid of the state.
No, I'm actually quite a moderate, centrist type of person. So,
right. Okay, listen.
I mean, I'm from Western Canada, and we're a little more on the libertarian end of things, but not in any. I'm a Canadian, you know. Canadian political radicals are just not that common.
Your book is marinated in religious language.
Yes.
Set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world. That's got the cadences of the Bible behind it about setting your house in order. I was brought up an English Methodist. I want to know, what is your religious framework? I'm just back from New York, so you're clearly a North American Protestant.
Yes, I think that's very fair to say. That's my background. My family was a member of my mother in particular was a member of the mainstream Protestant church in Canada, which happened to be the United Church. Although I was disenchanted with religious thinking by the time I was about 12 or 13. It's not that there's anything special about that, but I became very much interested in the role that narrative plays in orienting people in life, and delved deep into it when I was studying totalitarianism, and which I did in depth. Well, I have been doing that for 40 years, really. And that led me down to the deepest of stories. And by definition, the deepest of stories are religious. I mean, it's the fact that they're deep that makes them religious, or vice versa. And so I've strived to understand what those stories mean.
Okay, that makes it sound very scholarly. Mm-hmm. It's not with you. It's inside you. It's not you are religious, aren't you?
Well, it would depend to some degree.
No, don't get epistemological on me. Okay, what I'm asking you is, you're a believer. Now, of course, what it means to believe is different, but the reason I'm interested in this is your commitment to individual responsibility has a religious history to it.
It has a religious aspect to it, sure. It has a religious layer to it, let's say. And I would say that the battle that I found myself involved in wasn't a political battle or even a psychological battle. As far as I'm concerned, it's actually a theological battle. So because I see what's happening in the universities as the pushback of a fundamentally collectivist viewpoint against the cardinal Western stance that the individual is sovereign. And
hold on there. That's where we begin. There is, of course, Emerson's great essay on self-reliance. Frank Sinatra's My Way. America has the deepest belief in the individual, at least one strand of American thought, but that doesn't exhaust the West. There are lots more communal versions of life. In fact, one of the things I would have said, and I'm not a Christian now, one of the things I would have said about Christianity is it believes in the communal and in the collective. That's why people go to church. Well,
I would say it believes in the proper relationship between the individual and the collective, not that it believes in the collective. And I mean, and I think I'm fully in that tradition, because I think that the way that you want to orient yourself in life is to set yourself up so that you're taking care of yourself properly, but so that you're doing it in a manner that benefits your family and your community, and that all of those levels of organization have to be serving one another, and that they can.
Now, I understand that, and that's a perfectly reasonable position, but it mustn't be conflated with the Western view is the individual is primary, because that's historically not the case.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think that the emphasis on the idea of the logos in the West and the fact that individuals are regarded in some sense as the carriers of that does make the individual primary from a conceptual perspective. Because one of the questions is...
But Catholicism doesn't even believe in that. Catholicism, one of the founding forms of Christianity in the West, that doesn't believe in this wonderful American Protestant view of yours.
Well, why would you say that belief isn't held? Because of the emphasis on the importance of the church?
Because you can only survive, you can only go to heaven through the church. It's communal, it's collective. Let me give you an example. You and I are both old enough to have watched Spartacus, the Stanley Kubrick novel. There's a Stanley Kubrick film. There's a great moment in there when Kirk Douglas stands up and says, "I am Spartacus." And everybody else around him stands up and says, "I am Spartacus." That is the act of a collective communal sense. It's not an individual responsibility. It's, to use an old European term, it's solidarity.
Well, I'm going to stand by my claim. I think that if you distribute the Christian belief systems along a spectrum, you'd see that the Protestants are more individualistic than the Catholics. I'm certainly willing to grant you that. But I still think that the idea that the individual is to be regarded as of paramount importance with regards to such doctrines as the salvation of the individual soul and the, let's say, the internal value of the soul is still something that puts the individual in a sovereign position conceptually. And so that doesn't eliminate the importance of the collective in the least, because it is also very much about balance. You could say that the kingdom of God is within you and without you, outside of you, at the same time. And I think that's a reasonable way of looking at it, because it's a matter of harmony.
No, but forgive me, but you don't say that. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. You're giving priority to an internal transformation. Now, one response to that is, why can't you do both at the same time? Set your own house in order and set the world's house in order at the same time.
That's a good question. I think it's because
but that's not what you say.
No, and it's not something I agree with. I think the reason for that fundamentally is because this is partly because of my training as a social scientist, is that the first thing you want to do is the least amount of harm possible. And if you put your own house in order, the probability that you're going to bring grief to the world is very, very low. Whereas if you start meddling in the function of higher order systems, especially when you don't understand them, the probability that you'll translate your good intentions into proper outcome is very, very low.
Okay, let me give you back a historical sociological example. Let's just imagine you'd have had the opportunity to talk to Martin Luther King. And you'd have said, don't go on those civil rights marches until you sort out your personal ethics. You wouldn't have gone down that route, would you? What Martin Luther King did, and not only Martin Luther King, because you quote Tolstoy, and Tolstoy in War and Peace is endlessly meditating. Does, as it were, Napoleon get pushed across the Rubicon by the troops, or does he lead the troops? These are historiographical arguments. But actually, you can't wait to set your own house in perfect order, because we're dead before that happens. And second, civil rights wouldn't have happened on your principle.
Well, I don't know if it's reasonable to view what might be true for exceptional individuals as something that should be made the common norm. Like what I was objecting to in that chapter were two things, I guess. One was the proclivity of universities to teach 18-year-old and 19-year-old people that their primary obligation is to be an activist for sociological transformation in the world, which I think is a dreadful mistake.
It's a dreadful mistake because they're 18-year-old students, or it's a dreadful mistake?
No, it's a dreadful mistake because they're 18-year-old students. They have more proximal things to attend to, and they don't know anything. They seriously don't know anything. And so...
Yeah, they do know things. Come on, 18-year-olds do know things. You've got children, I've got children. Both of them are older than 18 now. I wouldn't have liked to sit opposite my 18-year-old and tell them they didn't know anything.
Well, they know enough to put certain things immediately in front of them in order and to attend to their education, but they don't know enough to risk experimenting with large-scale transformations of economic systems that they don't understand in the least.
Okay.
No, not that that's the case for many people. And the other problem with the activist ethos, which is partly what I was objecting to, is that it's very easy for your bitterness to manifest itself as the hypothetically altruistic desire for social change. And I think that happens far more often than people are willing to admit. And so partly you have to wonder if you're attempting to change the world, because you don't want to do the changes that are necessary for yourself.
You do increasingly sound to me like a good radical Protestant, but I want to give you another example, which is different. You know, if you'd have said set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world when you're 18 and at universities, it might have been a more defensible thing to say. But let me give you another example. There's a football match where 90-odd people died from Liverpool. The claim at the beginning was they were badly behaved hooligans, and the police blamed these Liverpool supporters for doing this. The mothers, the fathers, the sons, the brothers, the wives got together and became activists. It took them 25 years to demonstrate actually that what the police had claimed was untrue. Now, they were not going for vengeance.
Right.
They were going for justice. And actually, I really read this book carefully.
Yeah, it
and
seems
the word,
that way.
And the word justice is really not much there. The word vengeance, that's why I think you're an old-fashioned Old Testament guy. The word justice is hardly the word. Vengeance is very prominent in the book. Now, I'm telling you that these Hillsborough families were after justice, not after vengeance. They acted collectively. They didn't know enough.
No, they had their personal reasons. It was part of their own destiny, fair enough.
They were after justice.
Well, and I'm not going to make the case that collective action is never necessary. I mean, and as I said, I wrote the book in some sense as an antidote. The prevailing ethos is that the highest order of being is political activism, and that's especially the case in the universities. And so, you know, now and then things need to be pushed back into their proper position. So it's not like political action or the desire for justice, which I think is a better way of thinking about it, is never justified. Of course it is.
And
but it's also difficult to discriminate it from revenge. So
no, yes and no is the response to that. Vengeance is personal, it's self-interested. Justice is about vindication rather than vindictiveness.
Yeah, right.
And if that's the case, then you can separate out justice from vengeance. And to be frank, there's no reason an 18-year-old, and there were plenty of 18-year-olds amongst these Hillsborough families, shouldn't be active.
Well,
and there's a kind of quietism about you which actually surprises me.
Well, I don't want to make the case, or to be seen to making the case, that action at some level other than the psychological is never warranted, because obviously that's not the case. But I would say that we have quite self-evidently swung way too far in the opposite direction.
Who's we? Who's we?
The universities, the social sciences, the humanities in particular, women's studies, cultural studies, so these groups that do nothing but produce activists.
Forgive me, I was a professor of literature, so that's simple historical and factual nonsense. I mean, if universities were turning out social activists in very large numbers, it is a fight that's going on. It is a fight in the university, but I suppose what I'm asking...
How long ago were you a professor?
I've been a visiting professor quite recently, until I turned to the wonderful age of 65, when I stopped being a professor. But the point I suppose I'm trying to ask you about, there are injustices in the world. And because there are injustices in the world, you may think, and you may in certain ways be right, that the ways in which these social activists operate is not helpful. But by addressing them rather than the problems, you're avoiding the major issues, which are issues of injustice.
Well, it depends on what you think the major issues are. Like, as far as I'm concerned, the major issues are whether or not people have put their houses in order. And like you see the world, apparently, and fair enough, I'm not suggesting that you're wrong. It's not how I look at the world. You know, you, at least in the way that you're expressing it in this argument, is you see large-scale collective injustices and regard it as people's fundamental what I
No,
suppose.
no. Listen, I wouldn't dream to speak for Martin Luther King or even for the Hillsborough survivors. What I'm saying is, historically and in contemporary terms, there are people who've taken other views that can't be reduced to they want vengeance. They want justice.
Fair
but
enough.
the book doesn't recognise those other positions. The book tends to reduce.
I see very little of the pursuit of justice characterizing the modern university. I see a tremendous amount of the pursuit of vengeance for things that don't even deserve to